Wind and Tide. Just before we return to part 2 of our interview with parenting specialist Ann Douglas, we'd love to ask for some input from you.
This January, we head into our second year and season of Family 360, and we would love to gather some feedback.
Yeah, we'd love to know what you'd like to hear more of, what episodes you've enjoyed, what topics or questions you'd like us to explore.
All of the above. We'd also love to know how the production of the episodes resonate with you. We're finding our interviews increasingly flowing into 2 episodes.
Does that work for you?
And anything else you choose to share.
We would really value your input. And when you leave us a comment, you'll be linked to a beautiful solo Christmas album to stream on the music service of your choice. Created by Roy for those quiet evenings when your kids are in bed and you just want to exhale. Our gift to you. This album is honestly a #1 favorite in my family. You will love it.
Thanks for that, Rachel.
It's true. It's an amazing album.
So pop onto our website,
family360podcast.com.
Yes, just go to the question tab and you'll find lots of space for comments and questions.
And now, let's get started. Hello and welcome to Family 360,
a podcast of conversations exploring life together,
parenting, and all the ways we are family to each other. I'm Rachel Cram, educator and founding director of Wind and Tide Education Community.
I'm Roy Salmon, audio producer and founder of Whitewater Studios. And together, we're the hosts
of Family 360, interviewing specialists,
artists,
and storytellers.
And now for this week's episode.
This is the second of a 2-part interview with best-selling author and parenting specialist Ann Douglas. If you've not yet listened to part 1, we encourage you to go to our previous episode as it sets the stage for today's conversation.
Ann Douglas dedicates her work to helping parents nurture their children and themselves through the inevitable storms of family life. In part 1 of our interview, Ann ended talking about the loneliness and stress of navigating through a mental health crisis, personally, with a child or a loved one.
Yes, she was talking about the importance of finding support from not only professionals, but of other families who have sailed in similar storms.
Yeah. So let's jump right back into our conversation with parenting specialist Ann Douglas.
You talk about there being default settings for stress.
Yes.
And that we uniquely respond to stress. Some people detach, some people worry, some people get angry, some people eat.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what I've figured out over the years is social support is key, and so is exercise. It took me until I was 50 years of age to actually see that there could be mental health benefits to walking on a regular basis. And now I'm that obnoxious person who wears a fitness bracelet and gets her steps in every day. But I have found it has been the most effective thing for me. And
so you're saying for everybody, exercise.
Yeah. Well,
there are some things I think
that are almost universal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because as I'm reading your book, I'm thinking different people will resonate with different strategies of care.
And it's a case of experimenting with the ones that will work most for you or that are most practical in your life. We're all going to have things that work or don't work. My cousin Karen, her stress relief is doing cross stitch. To me, that would be torture. That would just ramp my stress right out. But she says sitting down to write something, no, just pull her fingernails off now.
But writing for you works, which is perhaps one of the reasons you have 30 books. So
yeah, exactly. And when we went through the stillbirth, I wrote an 8,500 word journal that was like a stillbirth diary of family journeying through stillbirth and coming out the other side. So that was my process to make sense of all those feelings in the moment.
Our brains don't function at their best when we're feeling stressed. That's a quote from your book. And then you suggest techniques for stress management. Can you share some of those techniques, some coping skills?
A really good strategy is to question that voice in your head. So if you have a voice in your head that's saying, it's all your fault, you're doing it all wrong, how can you reframe that in a more helpful way? And sometimes, again, it's like the social support piece, talking through those feelings with a friend, and they can say, you're being really hard on yourself, and here's what I see. I see a parent who's really committed, who's moving heaven and earth to try and make things better for their kid, and who, yes, today got grumpy and snapped at their kid because they were completely depleted, and who is going to hit the reset button and go back in the trenches tomorrow and try to do better.
Well, we blame ourselves, don't we?
Yes.
But it's one of those natural defaults.
Yes,
that
because we
fall
want
into.
it's safer to blame yourself because then you have a cause and effect kind of thing happening, as opposed to my child is struggling and I have no idea why and I have no idea what to do. Your brain does not like uncertainty, so it would rather have you being mean to you than you just wondering what the heck's going on.
So how do we recognize that about ourselves? How do we recognize that as a habit? And how do we start to break that pattern?
Right. I think it starts out by recognizing that this is a really human way of reacting and that a lot of us fall into this pattern. I'm thinking back to a couple of decades ago when my baby was stillborn, and my brain wanted to know why that happened. And so I came up with a theory of what had happened. Like, she ended up with a knot in her umbilical cord. So I said to myself, maybe it was that time I fell down half a flight of stairs. That might have been it. It could have tied a knot in the umbilical cord. Or maybe it was that time I was in a hotel swimming pool with the kids and I was doing somersaults over and over again. Maybe that's when the knot got tied in the umbilical cord. So I went to the family doctor and I said, do you think it was this? Do you think it was that? And he said, you know what? It could have happened when you were sound asleep, lying in bed. She could have just rolled over and that could have been it. And I remember thinking it was such a sense of relief for him to give me that information because I needed someone to challenge that theory of mine in order for me to rewrite it and recognize that it wasn't anything I did. It was just a terrible accident that happened. And yet I had been craving that certainty. Our brains do not like uncertainty. So sometimes we will rush to blame ourselves as a way of managing that uncertainty, even if it means being really harsh and critical towards ourselves or blaming ourselves for things that weren't even in our control. So I think a big first step is to listen to the voice in your head. Ask yourself if you're being really self-critical or if you could actually be a little fairer and kinder to yourself. For me, learning about self-compassion has been life-changing.
Yeah, and that started by choosing to speak the words of your head out loud to an expert.
Yes, just having that conversation, because if I had been too afraid and I'd kept all those dark thoughts in my head, that probably would have solidified as permanent truth in my narrative, in my life story. Whereas having somebody challenge that was so helpful. I've written that doctor fan letters over the years just to express my appreciation because I don't think that sometimes people who work with people in times of struggle recognize the life-changing pivot that a simple sentence can make.
Yeah, it's so great to appreciate people like
Yes.
that. So sharing those dark thoughts was important for clarity and for self-compassion. And you've researched other techniques or awarenesses that we can have when those ruminating thoughts start to come into our minds.
Yes.
Of blame or self-doubt.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a really big one is just to be aware that this is starting to happen. I can feel in my body like a tensing up that happens. And some people might find that they're not breathing deeply enough. They're not taking in enough oxygen, or suddenly their back hurts or their fists are clenched. Everybody will have slightly different manifestations, but learning what your unique warning signs of stress are and then saying to yourself, I am feeling stressed. Sometimes just acknowledging what it is you're feeling, that can start to put the brakes on. And then you want to pivot to acceptance. Instead of saying, oh, everything's fine, we'll just march along, I don't have time to be feeling stressed or sad today. You say to yourself, this is the way I'm feeling. Today is a hard day, and acknowledging that. And I think another big one is just taking mini vacations from the worry. Saying to yourself, for the next 20 minutes, I'm just going to put the brakes on that. I'm going to listen to some music that I find soothing. And sometimes it really helps to just stumble across a song lyric or a line of poetry, and it's like an aha moment that just captures what you're feeling.
Oh, yeah. Like, do you have an example, like a go-to song?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it was this one line in Alanis Morissette's song, Thank You. And the line is, I may be botching this a little bit, but it's like, the moment I let go of it was the moment I had more than I could handle. The moment I jumped off of it was the moment I touched down.
Such a great lyric.
It is. So I love that song. Like, that is one of my go-to songs on the darkest of days.
Go Alanis.
Yes.
Go Canada.
I know. Canadian content. Yay.
Yay. Okay, so we digressed a bit. What else would constitute a mini vacation from your worries? Do you want to finish that off?
Right. So just finding your own strategies, like I'm going to lose myself in the busyness of an activity, because sometimes that is even more therapeutic than trying to relax. You actually do a puzzle, solve a crossword puzzle or something, because your brain has to focus on that. It's hard to think of the clues if you're just worrying, right? And giving yourself permission, because I think sometimes we feel guilty if we say, my child's in crisis, I should actually sit here and stare out the window for 20 minutes. Yes, you should, because you'll be more refreshed and you'll be in a better place to go back and roll up your sleeves and start doing all that researching and loving and connecting.
I think often we feel like this is just too much. Like parenting alone is massive. And when you start to see something like a mental health crisis on the horizon, it can just feel like it is going to be too much. And it's so intense when it's your child. I've heard this quote that says, when we have children, we mortgage our hearts for the rest of our lives.
Totally.
And it's a huge investment. But you also talk about the reality is that you as a parent are your child's not only best bet, you are the bet.
Yes.
For them. And there's no point in waiting for a mental health fairy. And you have a really powerful story around that discovery for yourself.
Yeah. There was one time when Julie was in crisis and we had to call the police because she was missing. And so Neil, my husband, went out with the police officer looking for her. And when they did find her and bring her back home, I remember having this conversation on the front porch, standing there, feeling like my world was falling apart. And the police officer was lovely and so human. And he took me aside and he said, if you're waiting for some kind of mental health fairy godmother to step in and save your child, there is no such thing as a mental health fairy godmother. It's going to take you moving heaven and earth to make things better for this kid. Because I honestly thought there was some outside expert who had all the strategies and resources and expertise. And then I realized that we were going to have to find those solutions and put together sort of a path forward for our daughter until she was able to carve out a path forward for herself.
And that becomes so complex because you're a working person. You're thinking these appointments are going to happen during the day.
Yes.
Well, I'm going to work, and that means I'm going to have to tell people at work about this situation and ask for time off, which can stir into a whole nother realm of feeling.
Yes. It's really hard for people to manage. Yeah. It's like a very stressful kind of juggling act. But I realized very quickly, whenever my kids were in crisis, I was in crisis and I wasn't going to be a lot of good to the outside world. So yes, I sometimes missed out on opportunities, but I needed to protect some of my own capacity, right, in order to be able to function and cope. So such a juggling act. We've come so far with stigma. We still haven't come 100%. And people tend to be very judgmental of parents. So it could be really hard for someone to go to HR and say, my child's in crisis, they're in the hospital, I need to take a few weeks off, because they're worried that people are going to be whispering behind their back and saying, bad parents. So lots of emotions for people to manage on that. I think if you can find one workplace ally, like one person who's maybe walked a similar walk or has an aging parent with a health crisis, who can say, it's completely legit to have a family. We don't have to put 110% of our energy into work. And you have the right to have a life, and you have a right to be there for your family members in a way that feels good and right to you. That can be hugely validating. Everybody's going to find themselves in that situation eventually.
With realizing there's no mental health fairy, there's also the reality of navigating an emerging health situation in your own family, looking at this child maybe needing to be parented differently than the other children, with maybe some different rules, some different expectations.
Yes. I'm laughing because our daughter Julie is like the rule police in the family. So she was always very quick to point out how the rules evolved from child to child. And
Which happens in any family.
Exactly. And we'd have to say, these are Julie's rules, those are Scott's rules, or whatever. And I'm sure all 4 kids could make the case that they got the short end of the deal and other people lucked out. But as parents, you're an improv artist. You're thinking in the moment. You're trying to figure out what to do in this situation while not being so freestyle that there's no structure or consistency, because the wheels go off that scenario pretty quickly too. So I think we have to allow ourselves to be imperfect and to make mistakes and to figure out what will work over time and to be prepared to change our course or our game if we find that, you know what, that worked beautifully last week, this week, not so much.
I know with my own children, they will frequently say, "That's not fair. You let him do this," or
at such and such an age.
Yeah, that's right. And the older ones can feel like, "Are you serious? I wasn't allowed to watch that until I was 16, and you're letting this younger one watch this on TV at 10." So those conversations happen. But when you know it's to do with a mental health situation, how transparent or how verbal are you about that with your children? Do you say, "Well, your brother is having this because of his ADHD or because of their bipolar disorder"? How much candor do you reveal to your kids?
I think we tried to be very upfront in the moment. So we talked about the fact that, we're sending Ian to a private school right now because we're trying to see if this is the solution. It wasn't. He pivoted back to the public school system after a couple of experiments. And we have to make that investment, because if we don't make that investment now, his whole trajectory of development is going to not be what it could. Obviously, we didn't use that language talking to other children, but you get the drift. We sort of let them know it was in the long-term interest of the whole family for everybody to have an opportunity to do well. So it's sort of like a sharing of resources, not like a recipe where everybody's entitled to 25% in a family with 4 kids, because that's just not reality.
Yeah. I think the worry that I would have as a parent is that some of my children may feel overlooked or invisible within the dynamics of our family life. Do you get a sense of that with your kids?
Over time, sometimes the kids did have questions or concerns. So we had to have tough conversations, even when they were older teenagers, young adults, sort of reconstructing what had happened during earlier times in our family. I apologized to them for the fact that when our baby was stillborn, I was a mummy zombie for about 6 months. I was barely keeping my head above water. I literally felt like I was emotionally drowning. And I said, I wish that I hadn't been that way in that moment, because I know you guys were dealing with your grief, and then you had a zombie mummy on top of it all. And even with the allocation of parental energies, we were very open about the fact that when Julie was in crisis, she got about 3/4 of our attention as parents, leaving tiny slices of 8-9% for the 3 brothers, if you're looking at that kind of pie graph picture. And luckily, over time, I think the kids understood that we did have limited resources and we did the best we could in the moment. And they have said really kind and reassuring things on that front. So it's sort of like a sharing of resources in a family, right?
I think often as a parent, I look to my children and think, what will they be in therapy for that they have inherited from me, their family of origin? And the reality is, I think we all are going to need to sort out situations that happen in our family of origin. Part of how you do your research for your books is you interview hundreds of families in different situations. I'm wondering if you can describe a family where that has gone really poorly, as how they've navigated the care for their children in the midst of a mental health situation with one of their children or more, and one where it's gone really well.
Right. I think at the one extreme where things haven't gone so well, there can be a lot of resentment and outbursts. And, well, if he's going to get attention by acting out at school, I'm going to one-up him. because clearly that's the way you get attention in this family. Or my brother needs a lot of attention, so I'm going to be the perfect child. I'm going to pivot to not causing mom or dad or the grandparents or anybody even an iota of worry. I'm just going to be the perfect child. And you can see neither of those are very healthy. But in terms of good outcomes in the sibling relationship, I remember one family in particular that I interviewed for Parenting Through the Storm said that they thought that having a child with struggles in the family opened up a world of empathy for the siblings, because they could see that life really was hard for this brother. And so they would be that kid who would sit with another kid who was on the sidelines in their classroom, or who, would not just look at somebody and say, that person's acting strange, but say, I wonder what's going on with that kid, and maybe say a kind word. So it's not all a negative, and it's not all a cakewalk. It's sort of somewhere in the middle, right?
So what makes the difference between the two? What are the things that parents can do to land them in the camp of empathy with their children?
I think some of it is probably beyond the parent's control. It's the developmental stage of a child when the crisis hits. It's the temperament of that child. So those are tough variables to have a huge amount of control over. But in terms of your own reaction, I think finding ways to invest love and attention in the child who might otherwise feel shortchanged, and letting them know that they don't have to be that perfect child. They don't have to prove anything to you, that they're worthy of your love just by being there, and expressing appreciation when they do kind things for the sibling, or when they make sacrifices, because so many sacrifices may be required if the sibling can't handle the family dinner in a restaurant and you have to hit the eject button. That is hard for everybody in the family, and sometimes you don't have the luxury of an extra parent to sit there and stay with the kids who haven't had a chance to eat their French fries or something before everybody has to run out of the restaurant.
You said in your book, Parenting Through the Storm, decades later, we are still doing relational repair for events that occurred earlier. And I find that a joyful process. That to me is just the reminder that it's not all about this moment in time.
No.
There's always a tomorrow to come back and revisit the past.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's the image of the relationship movie rather than the relationship snapshot. If your whole life as a parent is caught in this one clip, it might not be your favorite picture of parenting. But when you have the chance to talk about what happened in the past and reconstruct the narratives and talk about it from my experience versus your experience, what was I thinking in that moment? What were you thinking? Did you misread my busyness and attention to your brother as a lack of caring, or that I loved him more? That wasn't it at all. We were just treading water as a family. Those kind of conversations. It means being vulnerable as a parent, because your child might say, I was deeply wounded by XYZ, and not for you to try to talk them out of those feelings, but just to say, I'm so sorry, it was hard for you in that moment, and I could see why you felt this, that, and the next thing.
I just think not becoming defensive is key to those heart-to-heart conversations.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've ever had an argument with your partner, you know that getting through that process where everybody's crying and upset, and then you come out the other side and you feel so connected. It's like, I totally see your point of view and you see mine, and now we're recommitted to the relationship. That can happen over time in parenting as well. And what matters in a family, I think, is that you keep making the outreach and making the effort if you are feeling that distance and you want to close it, or you want to clarify an earlier misunderstanding.
Yeah, that takes a lot of the pressure off in the moment, doesn't it?
You don't have to be perfect, or else it's done forever.
Yeah. I think it takes off pressure to know there's going to be a time when you're not in the middle of the storm, and you can go back and look at it then and still bring some healing to it at that point in time.
Right. And in our family, we laugh about how chaotic things were in those years, and things like Scott going to school and coming home wearing socks as opposed to shoes one day because of his ADHD. He was just like on his own planet. Who needs to think about shoes? They become the stories of family legend. So in the moment, they're like so frustrating. It's so embarrassing when the school calls you and says your child doesn't have shoes. But you get through it, and then it becomes something to talk about afterwards. And sometimes the kids will ask questions like, what was it like for you in this moment? And it's a wonderful opening to say, you know what? I was feeling overwhelmed. So if you were thinking Mom is losing it, yeah, Mom was losing it because she was really feeling overwhelmed by all these things at once. Or they only saw their own thread in the story and they didn't realize that, meanwhile, Mom and Dad were also dealing with this, this, and this, and you were only aware of your own challenges in that moment. So
yeah. There's just a desire, I think, sometimes to want to be the family or the parent that does everything just right. There's buckets full of pride and pretense that you got to give up to get to that humor, dark or light.
Yeah,
humor,
exactly. And I think for a long time, I was a perfectionist. I think that was a little bit of a legacy from my childhood, wanting control, wanting order. And, you know, my inner control freak does visit occasionally and sort of say, we want everything to be predictable and so on. But learning to say to myself, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to say and do the wrong thing. And just to be a little more compassionate to myself, that has been life-changing. That takes the pressure off everything.
Learning to be compassionate towards ourselves, I think that's a key even to how we respond to others.
Yes.
What do you suggest as a starting place towards self-compassion?
I think with self-compassion, part of it is recognizing when the voice in your head isn't working. Do I really need to carry around a little inner critic that can just point out everything I'm doing wrong, or do I want something different for myself? And I think if you can think about what you would say to a friend, that's the easiest way to reframe it. Yeah. So saying, what would I say to Rachel? I'd be saying, Rachel, you know, I see so much love and caring and compassion, and I see how hard you're working on this, and I really hear your frustration, and parenting really is hard. Like just being able to say those kind of things to yourself.
Treat yourself as the cherished friend.
Yes. And also recognize that when you can treat yourself with self-compassion, suddenly that spills over and allows you to treat others with self-compassion, and it allows you to feel connected to as opposed to separate from the rest of humanity. So with self-compassion, you say, we're all human, we're all struggling, and so if somebody loses it in the grocery store, you can say to yourself, that person's probably just having a really bad day. It's nothing about that one roll of paper towels that fell on the floor that they felt the need to boot it down the aisle. That was about the 7 things that happened this morning on the way out the door. And even having that sense of compassion towards your own child, where my child is being difficult today. They are not being difficult in an effort to drive me around the bend. It's just really hard to be a kid some days. So I think if we can remind ourselves that parenting is ultimately about empathy. It's hard to be a parent and it's hard to be a kid. If we can recognize that, then we see it's a shared struggle and a shared opportunity.
And as we start to wind down this conversation, I'm wondering, as you consider listeners who may be realizing their child or family member is struggling with a mental health concern, is there a key nugget of encouragement that you would want to offer?
Oh, I'm just thinking back about me 15 years ago, what I really needed to hear. I needed to know that things could get better. You know, Julie, for the longest time, my goals for her were A, live, and B, finish high school. And I'm happy to tell you, not only did she finish high school, she went and studied photography, and she specializes in the beauty of broken and abandoned things. So where other people see brokenness, she sees beauty. And I think that's so significant given her earlier struggles. Scott, he was that computer-obsessed kid growing up and almost fixated on computers. That ended up being a strength in the end. He is working as a software engineer and is doing extremely well in his life and in relationships. Eric, the fellow with the extreme learning disability who I was worried would never finish high school, he not only managed to get through college, he went back and became registered as a chartered professional accountant and is running his own accounting practice and happily embedded in a relationship. And Ian, my guy who, you know, I remember seeing something awful from Google saying your child will never have a relationship and your child will never have a job. Totally wrong, Dr. Google. I'm happy to report that Ian is getting married in a couple of months, and he has a great full-time job and is doing well beyond my wildest dreams. So every single day I am grateful for the fact that yes, we weathered some significant storms, but we also found our way to drier land or less stormy pastures.
you have a really powerful ending to your book, Parenting Through the Storms. And I'm wondering, do you think this would be a good place to just maybe read that ending? Because I think that does wrap it up so well.
I would love to.
I don't know if the word wrap it up is right, because it's nothing about ending with a bow, but it gives hope.
It does. And I think that's so critical. So here we go.
Okay.
As you can see, all of my children are thriving in their own way. I couldn't be prouder. But what leaves me feeling incredibly happy at the end of the day is the fact that we continue to be a close, connected, and loving family. We managed to weather the stormiest of storms, times that could have torn our family apart. That's not to say that the storm clouds have receded permanently. I still keep a watchful eye on the horizon. I suppose I always will. But even if the dark clouds return, as they well might, and one of us ends up struggling with mental illness once again, I know we will continue to find our way together. We've come so far. We've learned so much. We've been strengthened by the storm.
Ann Douglas, thank you so much for your wisdom and your heart and your humility in speaking with me today. I've really appreciated this interview.
It was a great conversation. Thank you.
One of the recurring themes that we've heard, Rachel, throughout this first season of Family 360 is about compassion. The profound and the positive difference that compassion for others and for ourselves,
self-compassion,
makes in how we function as families and as communities.
And amidst this unsettled year of 2020 with the COVID pandemic, renewed focus on racial discrimination, political chaos.
Many storms, as Ann said.
Yeah, we found that conversation thread really encouraging.
We have. The concept of compassion is expansive, and knowing we wanted to pick up on it even further, we asked Ann if she had a poem that really encouraged her.
And she did.
She did.
Right away.
And it's a beautiful one by one of our favorites, Mary Oliver. And just before we jump into that, we invite you to join us for our next release, our Season 1 finale.
Woo! It's going to be epic.
A Family 360 reunion.
Yeah, so join us. And now, with much thanks to Ann Douglas,
thank you.
We are going to conclude her episode.
So here's Wild Geese by Mary Oliver. We hope you enjoy it.
You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for hundreds of miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about your despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and the deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clear blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. I'm Rachel Cram.
I'm Roy Salmond, and thank you so much for listening to Family 360.
To continue these conversations, find us at Family 360 on our website, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.
We'd love to journey with you.